Probably the first thing to think about is how, if they are going to grill a steak or if they're going to broil it, if they're going to put it over high heat, kind of the different cuts that you would consider would be a lot different than compared if you were going to make a pot roast. So that's kind of the first thing you kind of want to consider. For the most part, those cuts that would come from the center of the carcass, if it says loin or rib in it, for the most part, those cuts they're not muscles of locomotion. And for the most part, they will tend to be more tender than cuts that we would have from the forequarter or from the hindquarter or from the round, for the most part. So now there's certainly some exceptions to that, but so with that being the case, as the average consumer, as they go and come up and they think about buying cuts that would be exposed to high heat for grilling or whatever, they'd be thinking about cuts from the loin and rib predominantly. And the most tender cut would be the tenderloin steak, or sometimes it'd be marketed at retail or food service as a fillet. That would be the most tender cut. Sometimes it can have some interesting off flavors because of the physiology associated with that particular cut. A ribeye steak or a strip loin steak, those two cuts are essentially of the same muscle. They're just kind of different proximity along the carcass. And generally that ribeye will tend to have a little more fat within the muscle, and it certainly will probably have a little more seam fat between muscles because it will have more than one muscle there. A strip steak, it'll only have one muscle present for the most part. And so those two cuts would be one ratchet back in terms of tenderness as compared to that tenderloin steak, but they'll have a much more robust flavor as a whole as compared to that tenderloin steak. And the sirloin, which would be essentially the hip on the steer, there'd be several cuts that could be made from the sirloin. They'll be real comparable in flavor for the most part to that ribeye or strip loin, but they can be a little more variable in terms of tenderness. So for those cuts that come from what we call the middle meats relative to the rib and loin, those would be some of the primary steak cuts that would be generated there. And within those cuts, if most retailers are only going to offer, most of them are only going to offer one grade, one USDA grade of beef at retail. If by chance, if they did offer more than one, then generally speaking, those which are of a higher grade, you'd have less, a greater instance actually of eating satisfaction. So if there's not very many places at all at retail that sell prime beef, but the odds of an unsatisfactory eating experience is about 1.5%. For most choice product, it'll be some less than that, but it's probably 1 in every 10 or so that will have an undesirable eating experience. Select would be the next grade lowest. That's really the three grades, really when you get down to it. Choice and select are the two predominant grades which are offered by far at retail. And there's certainly going to be select steaks that will be very, very highly palatable, but there'd be a slightly higher incidence than we'd have with choice steaks in terms of having an undesirable eating experience somewhere along the way. It'll have a little less fat, it'll be a little more apt to temperature abuse and that kind of stuff. So those are some things to consider, and as you just look at those cuts at retail, if you're trying to decide between this package and the other, things that you would consider would be the amount of taste fat that they would have within the muscle, or marbling, that's intramuscular fat within the cut. You could look at the color of the product, and that's been shown that looks more youthful and brighter over a wide range. That generally has an association with improved palatability. And economically, if there's something that has more trimmable fat on it, you'd be paying the same price for that. So unless you want to, eat that big kernel of fat, you probably, that would be probably be something that you'd want to have trimmed off because it wouldn't really have the same value as compared to the remaining component of the steak. So for those middle meat cuts, those are things to consider. And there are certainly more economical options which can really be very highly palatable. You take just one rib essentially to the other side towards the head of the ribeye would be a chuck eye steak, and it's generally marketed at least $2 to $3 a pound less than a ribeye, and it is essentially a lower cost ribeye steak that might have a little more seam fat, but going to be very comparable in terms of flavor for sure. But yeah, those are all things to kind of consider when you think about selecting steaks at retail.